Hello, in this video I want to continue some of the conversation that we were having in the last one. We began this kind of like conversation introducing what we think about Derrida in relationship to how it relates to critical teams. I wanted to take a little bit of a pivot from some of the ideas that we've been talking about in terms of Derrida and like ontology, and particularly the speculative Marx that we did in some of the earlier videos where we were talking about how this argument particularly relates to policy teams, and take a little bit of a turn to talking about the way in which Derrida writes about the academy and the university. I think that there are a lot of authors from like Fred Moten to Hoof to a lot of other authors that are really trying to write about the university and the way in which it accumulates knowledge and the relationship between knowledge, power, and representation. I really find a lot of helpful insight in the way in which Derrida kind of writes about the university throughout various experiences that he kind of is like noting throughout his career. And I definitely think that a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the last video will be incredibly helpful for how we kind of like frame a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about in this video, partially because in a lot of these like two-part videos you don't usually see me doing the framing portion of the debate starting in the second video, but the first video was like so good, I think, in terms of really like introducing some of the base level ideas that Derrida has and talking about the university and the base ideas that Derrida is using to critique the university, that I think that it's like kind of required context in order to like jump into the framing and other portions of the debate that we're talking about here. So if you haven't, definitely check that out in the intro to Derrida in order to get context for the stuff that we'll be starting off in this conversation, because I definitely want to start off just talking a little bit about the framing overall. I don't think that Derrida's particular set of arguments that we talked about in the first video directly change a lot of the framing arguments that you would normally make with an academic kid that I've spoken about in other videos, and so I definitely don't want to be repetitive on that end. I think if you wanted to commit harder to the argument that Derrida is making in terms of the academy and want to use it in order to frame some of the arguments you're making, I think you need to explain deconstruction not just as like an alternative, as something that is like a method for the negative, but actually as like the purpose possibility for debate. That debate should be deconstructive of like the resolution, that it should be deconstructive of the way in which we like kind of like produce methodology and examples. And I think that that can kind of help with the maybe the basis for applying some of those thesis level considerations we've done in terms of how I was saying that you could complicate the examples debate in order to kind of apply to like an evaluation basis that like we should be striving towards the complication of the relationship between text and like representation and like the reality of experience, etc. And I think that being able to do that through the testing of the examples that are offered in terms of these as method and being able to speak through those in ways that really contest them head on and the interpretation the app is pushing can be a really good way for you to frame the debate in a way that I think can lean into a variety of methodologies and could still allow you to access other arguments from Derrida if you really wanted to, like ontology on the alternative, etc. And I think it's really just a question of you explaining that like deconstruction as a method allows us to be continually cautious of like the ability for the university to operate as a source of total knowledge, even in the way in which it proposes like revolutionary ideas, which I think can be like a really interesting way for you to kind of like walk into a lot of critical debates and set the basis for competition. Because then I think when you're transferring onto your link debate, all of the arguments that you're making about like the way in which the affirmative produces this kind of like illusion between meaning and text, I think really allows you to push the harms of the kind of way in which the 1AC is presented, and I think create like a unique reason or set of reasons for why the 1AC should be rejected, and which I generally think is like a much better place for you to build diversity out of your alternative out of your link arguments, especially in the context of the Academy K, because I think that you're building link arguments that are kind of linked to the same kind of framing question that centers it around like the process of deconstruction, but you're also able to win that there are kind of like diverse ways in which you can contest various forms of the examples that the affirmative is giving, and each kind of in context example offense that you're giving to the examples sets up a new type of link argument that I think can be powerful against like a lot of arguments made later on in the debate, and that I think generally can help you really show like your performance of the alternative, whichever one you choose, as you kind of like go through this process of like producing that offense in the link debate. This is kind of what transitioned you, I think, into like a really clean permutation debate, because I think that when you're debating against the permutation against these K teams, when you're reading this type of argument, you really want to like stick them to the type of presentation of examples in the 1AC, and I think this comes from both cross-ex and from the lines that you pull, from like the way in which they attempt to like iconograph certain like ways, tactics, movements, people, etc. that they kind of use in order to ground their kind of methodology. And I think using that as like a point for contestation can be a really good place where you force teams into like not being able to just like kick out of certain examples or certain people without there being like harmful effects for how it trickles into the rest of the debate, thus making, I think, like a lot of like clear ways for you to articulate why things like the permutation don't actually operate, and why they kind of like don't functionally make sense, because you're proving within context of how they worked historically and the kind of missteps that have happened there. And I think that it can be really hard for the affirmative to win the way in which they're presenting the AvWorks as a corrective to those things, if they haven't already been explained in the 1A sphere, that there isn't like this kind of like evidence that is like already present like earlier on in the debate to really refute this type of claim. Then when you're moving on to the impact comparison, I don't think that Derrida kind of changes a lot of the advice that I give in here, because a lot of the stuff that I said in the last videos that I've kind of done about the Academy K across this channel have really been about why I think that like impact comparison at the level of like magnitude and stuff like that is really hard to do against critical teams without like falling back into maybe some of the criticisms that you want to make with the Academy K, and the problematization with like a lot of normative use of impact calculus. But I do think that you can make a lot of arguments about like why all of the examples that you're giving on the link debate prove that there's a magnification of violence from the stuff that the affirmative is investigating via the way in which they choose to produce like certain forms of representation that they think are desirable, when in actuality the kind of like inevitable erasure that happens to the like way in which we compartment or like representation to like the limitations of things like academic presentation not only produce the academy as like a source of power which like magnifies violence in various like ways through like neoliberalism, privatization, etc., but also it continually kind of produces this kind of way of thinking about the relationship that we have to knowledge in such a way that it is kind of like always meant to block out the ability to create like ways of engaging unique creation or like engagement with spaces beyond the locus of the academy as such. And I think that that type of like psych investment is something that you can really bring out as a methodological hit against the way in which the affirmative is positioning itself to debate, to the resolution, etc. Additionally, I think that the alternative can be a place where you can usually use a lot of the ways in which you've been talking through other portions of the flow, like the link debate, the permutation, impact comparison, etc., especially with these considerations from the first video. I think can be really helpful in order for you to bring like a full package in terms of like why the alternative looks like the process in which the negative is undertaken throughout the debate. And I think that can really help you kind of like make a lot of arguments that make your framing argument and your alternative flow so well together, because you're constantly fulfilling the framing argument that you set off earlier in the debate by continually proving the usefulness of it in the way in which you analyze the 1AC and produce unique portions of offense and like places of contestation through the kind of like prior framing question, which exemplifies the way in which your alternative kind of like produces various forms of generative refusal in the debate. And I think continually allows you to move like for unique reasons why the alternative is kind of beneficial in its usage, which I think overall is just a good way for you to kind of strategically go about debate. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into the next videos that I'll be doing in terms of talking about Derrida's application, the way I think teams can be executing and answer it, because I'm really enjoying doing this set of videos. Thanks.